Yo, 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 yo. All right, so I'm a little sick, but we're going to power through this and we're going to talk about an introductory set of concerns before we get into Exodus. All right, so we finished Genesis and now we're moving on to Exodus. Now, what I wanted to do for this video is just leave a quick little set of introductory remarks about the composition of the Torah, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the first 5 books of the Bible, and which are oftentimes referred to as the Jewish Bible, Torah, the Law. Christians look to it, Jews look to it, and Muslims look to it as being an essential set of holy texts as divinely inspired. Okay, so the conservative and traditional explanation of the composition is that Moses wrote all 5 of these in about the 14th century BC. The reason that's important is for a few reasons. From the conservative perspective, if Moses wrote these books, then what you have is a sense in which there's almost a divine dictation from God, maybe on Mount Sinai, Horeb, or perhaps at least through some kind of transmission via the Holy Spirit, something along those lines, that is consistent, that explains how this text was intentionally breathed out by God. This is a phrase that Christians will use. It actually is derived from the scriptures, where it's sometimes referred to as that the word is breathed out, literally expired, as instead of inspiration, expiration. So they really want to cling to this because they think that it increases the gravitas, that it legitimates and grounds the Bible as being the Word of God, particularly the Torah as being a product of God through human hands, through the use of human narrative and story and parable and songs and things like that, but nevertheless, still a product of God primarily. Now, Jews also really advocate for this position. Conservative Jews more. Reform Jews, probably not so much. And obviously there's debate within Rabbinic traditions and within the Jewish tradition, but historically, it's extremely important for Rabbinic Judaism, which emerges around the 5th century BC, sometimes referred to as Second Temple Judaism, which is basically the dominant form of Judaism that we have today. It's some form of Rabbinic Judaism. It matters that Moses is the author because Moses is established as being within the tribe of Levi. He is a Levitical priest. He is born of Levites, and he then becomes the kind of head who then passes on the baton, let's say, to Aaron, who's his brother, through whom then the Levitical priesthood is issues, through whom it flows and follows. And that matters because the Levitical priesthood are the ones who administer and oversee the civil law and the customs and the daily rituals and things like that. So there's an important sense in which there's a lineage of legitimation, again, that is important by having Moses be the author of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, because that grounds the authority, that grounds the tradition, straight from the Levitical priesthood, from Rabbinic Judaism through the Levitical order, through the Aaronic order, the Aaronic priests, and then ultimately culminating in Moses, and Moses is called directly by God. So that's the conservative position. The scholarly position is very different. It is based on a couple of different theories that were developed in the 19th century by, there's some people in the 17th century as well, but really developed in the 19th century in Germany under the banner of something called the documentary hypothesis, or sometimes it's referred to as source criticism or historical criticism, literary criticism, but that doesn't mean the same thing that literary criticism means today. In the 19th century Germany, literary criticism meant something quite different. The kind of clearest designation is source criticism. And the reason it's called source criticism is that the documentary hypothesis claims that there were pre-existent sources that served as the foundational documents from which we derive Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that they weren't dictated by a singular author, but that they were compiled together by scribes later on, who were making composites of oral traditions. There is something called the Oral Torah as well, old parables. You actually even get references to these various other books throughout the Old Testament, where so-and-so will be like, oh, don't you remember the book of Jathar, I think, is one. We'll come across them later. And and as it says in the book of whatever the name is, insert name here. So there's a sense in which there are these preceding documents that even the Old Testament is aware of. So documentary hypothesis basically claims that what we have in Torah is a composition that is derived from these various documentary sources. Now, the original formulation and the kind of basic formulation of the documentary hypothesis states that there are four primary compositors or moments of composition, right? They're called the J, E, D, and P, or the J, E, P, and D sources. The J stands for the Yahwist, the E stands for the Elohist, the P stands for the priestly, and the D stands for the Deuteronomic. Now, each of them existed within different time periods. The oldest is the Yahwist and the Elohist, and the more recent are the priestly and the Deuteronomic. And they are hypothesized, remember this is a hypothesis, they're hypothesized based on different literary trends, different styles, styles in grammar, the way that God's name is used and changed. In the Yahwist, for example, Yahweh, Jehovah, is used. In the Elohist, Elohim is used, or sometimes El Shaddai. The way that God is depicted is different in the priestly sources as opposed to the Yahwist or Elohist sources. So there are various reasons to try to explain and to support from the text itself, from the textual criticism, from the source criticism itself, that justifies and that connects, if you will, how these various different compositors compiled the Torah. Now, why does this matter? One of the main reasons is that the priestly source is the primary compositor. And I've said in previous other videos that it's most likely that most of these stories were written around the time of Babylonian captivity, which is, 6th century-ish, right? Now, this matters because that's obviously 800 years different than when Moses was around in the early patriarchs and things like that. So this matters because in the text there are references to things that we just don't have archaeological evidence that existed, or that we have pretty good archaeological evidence that it didn't exist until later, right? Like, for example, the domestication of camels is a big one that didn't exist in like the 14th century BC. So things like that kind of give us a clue. But the other thing that's really important, and you'll get a lot of like critical scholars, critical Jewish scholars, and then Old Testament scholars that will highlight this, that this is really important, that actually that the priestly compositors were the Talmudic authors as well. They were the Rabbinic Jews. They were of the Pharisee class. And the Pharisees were competing for power with the Essenes and the Sadducees. So if the text that we have that's survived is the one that is of the Pharisaical class, of the Rabbinic Judaistic class or tradition, then that means then that we don't really have the full flower of ancient Israelite practices prior to that. What we have is a particularly constructed set of practices, civil laws, beliefs, legitimation of power structures, for example, by setting up the Levitical priesthood and the Aaronic priesthood as being preeminent, the only way by which you can approach God. Those things matter because that establishes the theopolitical power structure of Israel during Babylonian captivity as they're seeking their own liberation from under the Babylonians, and then also that establishes how it is that Second Temple Judaism, which we now understand as being the beginnings of Rabbinic Judaism, are established, which is important also for helping us to understand the context of the New Testament as well, which takes place under the banner of this Rabbinic Judaism, and that's kind of one of the things that Jesus is responding to and criticizing in many ways, and that Paul then expands his criticism towards or against. So again, the reason this is important is this helps us understand a couple of things. One, this helps us understand how it is that the actual text was most likely compiled, which then gives us an insight into maybe some of the motivations and the reason behind compiling it the way that it is. Why are these stories told in this manner? Why are these stories told in this order? Why are these words used here and not there? When you see discrepancies, when there's a genealogy that's given this way and then a genealogy that's told in this way, or when there's a creation angle that's told from this direction and then you have a different creation story, why is that the case? And then, of course, when you have the beginning of Exodus, when you're told that Moses is of the house of Levi, why is that so important? Again, it's important because it justifies the power of the Levitical priesthood. And they're the ones who would have wanted to justify their power, right? They would have wanted to support and ground their supremacy as they were vying for power, especially under Second Temple Judaism, with the wealthy landowners at that time. There was a battle between the two, between the kind of religious caste or class and the landowner class, the wealthy landowner class. So again, it's extremely important that we understand that most likely, the authors of the Torah are also the authors of the Talmud, who are the rabbinic Judaistic teachers, the Levitical priesthood, and that they are in many ways establishing the myth that they do, the cosmology that they do, the law that they do, the stories that they tell, so that they can support, justify, and legitimate the very priestly orders and codes that they themselves are trying to practice, to enforce as well, and to hold together. I'm not saying that this is like nefarious, that they're sitting there like, we're power hungry and we're going to corrupt the truth so that we can get our own way. But there's a sense in which they are kind of probably ideologically biased. Now, I know this is more like a psychoanalytic critique and a critical take on something that is also still just a hypothesis. But nevertheless, I think it's extremely important to consider it, to understand it, and to think through the implications of it. And then just the last little bit that we need to understand is that there are even more radical interpretations or hypotheses about the documentary hypothesis or source criticism that even say that the Old Testament was written much more recent than even what the documentary hypothesis scholars argue. And they say that it was written during Second Temple Judaism. So now we're talking 5th century BCE, so around the 400s, maybe even earlier than that at some point. So that's when it was actually written, which means then what you have is Second Temple Judaism and the people of that time period and their expectations for a Messiah and their apocalypticism and all the other things that come along with Second Temple Judaism, which we'll talk more about as we keep going, but all of the characteristics that define that particular strain of ancient Judaism, that becomes the foundation, the paradigm by which the Torah is constructed. So yeah, so that's just a brief set of introductory remarks that I just wanted to share real quickly before I actually start talking about Exodus, because I could have talked about it, I guess, at the beginning, and maybe I should have, but actually the last couple of days, I myself have gone down a little bit of a rabbit hole, kind of looking through my old notes from my Old Testament classes, and then just thinking about this kind of a bit as well. And if you're interested in studying this further, there are plenty of great resources out there. You can start Googling documentary hypothesis, source criticism, Second Temple Judaism. So if you're interested in your own time, you can watch documentaries, short little YouTube vids. Obviously, Wikipedia isn't always the greatest source, but fuck it, if you're just trying to get Cliff's Notes, it's not exactly the worst thing in the entire world, so have fun going down a Wikipedia rabbit hole. And yeah, so check that stuff out, and I think that'll give us a much more historical and a much more critical framework for our approach to the rest of the Old Testament. And then, of course, as we move into the New Testament, which has its own theories about source criticism as well, but again, jumping way ahead of myself. Love you guys. See you soon.